Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 48 and 49. In chapter 48, verse 12, it mentions that Joseph removed his sons Ephraim and Manasseh from Jacob's knees. Were these boys then quite young and small?
You know, I think there we have to deal with what is probably some symbolic language that really speaks more to the deference that these two sons of Joseph are paying to their now aged grandfather who's in the process of dying, rather than an actual physical description of what's taking place. So likely what's happening here is we would think of this as, two kids are sitting on the knees of their grandfather. Probably more likely what's happening is that Joseph's sons are kneeling at the knees of where Jacob is on the bed. So they're more in a posture of preparedness to receive a blessing, which makes sense with the fact that Jacob's about to put his hands on the boy. So they're basically, if he's kind of sitting up or reclining in the bed, the brothers or the two sons of Joseph are coming, they're kneeling before his knees, and he's placing his hands over them for the blessing. That's really the image. And the reason for that is clearly these guys are not sitting on Jacob's knees. One, Jacob's old, frail man, he's about to die. And if we do the math, these guys are minimally in their early to mid 20s. So these guys are not climbing up onto Jacob's lap to receive the blessing here. The way that we do that math is just simply to say, we know that Joseph's sons, if we go back a few chapters, were born during the years of plenty in Egypt. There's then 7 years after that of famine. It's 2 years into the famine that Jacob and his family make their way from Canaan to dwell in Egypt. Jacob comes to Pharaoh when he's 130 years old. He's 147 years old at the conclusion of chapter 47. So if we put all those numbers together, at the very least at this point, these brothers are in their early 20s. Jacob himself has been in the land of Canaan for more than 17 years, or in the land of Egypt, for more than 17 years. So this isn't a physical description of two adult grown men crushing their grandfather to death by sitting on his knees. It's instead more of a metaphorical statement about their posture of deference and supplication of receiving a blessing, and they're kneeling in front of their grandfather, probably around his knees.
If Ephraim and Manasseh become two tribes of Israel, then how can there be a division of the land of Israel among the 12 tribes?
Right. So even if they replace, Joseph by becoming the half tribes, there's still kind of a numerical problem of how do we deal with the tribal allotments. And the way that this gets resolved in terms of the land grants that come later is, you recall when Jacob curses Simeon and Levi, he mentions that they will be dispersed throughout the land of Canaan. And that becomes very in the promised land and the future tribal allotments in the land of Israel, as Jacob says it. And that becomes very practically or literally realized for the tribe of Levi, because they become the tribe of the priests. They actually don't have a land allotment that's given to the tribe. So while the rest of the tribes are given these divisions of ground, Levi is not. So by removing both Joseph and Levi from what will be the future land allotments, that provides room for Ephraim and Manasseh, while legally they're kind of half tribes, so that there's a full now 12 when you subtract Joseph and add those two. In terms of the land divisions, by also removing Levi, you have a even 12 split of the land allotments for the tribes.
At the end of chapter 48, Jacob gives Joseph a mountain slope that he says he won from the Amorites with his sword and his bow. What is this in reference to?
Well, the answer to that simply is we don't know. We don't have an account of some event that happened in Jacob's life and his sojourning in Canaan that involved a fight with the Amorites that won him part of a mountain. And this does a few things for us. Number one, it reminds us that Moses is recording the most salient details of the patriarchs' lives. This isn't a moment-by-moment recording of everything that took place. So there are things that happen beyond what's recorded in the pages of Genesis in the lives of these men. It also reminds us within that it was a constant struggle for the patriarchs to be living in this land of promise that they had been given as a future inheritance, but that they were never going to immediately receive as their own in their lifetimes. So there is this constant unease of living in the land of Canaan, principally because of having to live among the Canaanites. There was never peace. There was constant struggle. We see that with the constant difficulty of living near the Philistines' land, and then now there's references here to the Amorites. We've had issues with the men of Shechem before, so that's the constant theme. And so we're reminded there have been more events in Jacob's life and more conflict with the people of Canaan than we're even given access to throughout the majority text of the Genesis narrative.
If Levi gets cursed in chapter 49, verse 7, why do the Levites become priests?
We're reminded again and again throughout the Old Testament of the surprising grace of God. We could apply the same question to each of the patriarchs themselves. Why does Abraham get to be the father of those who believe? Why does he get to be the father of the faithful? When we look at the ways in which he is so often faithless in his life, he not once but twice passes his wife off as his sister only so that he can escape certain death. He doesn't seem to believe that God is going to open his wife's barren womb, so he sleeps with his wife's servant Hagar. These moments of just head scratching immorality or faithlessness, and you just wonder what's the plan here. Or Isaac, who loves his sinful, immoral son Esau more than the son that God has said is going to be the one who carries on the promises in Jacob. Or Jacob's own regular acts of faithlessness throughout his life. And again, we see God's grace dealing with sinful people better than what they, by their acts, deserve. And this is what it means, what grace means: unmerited favor, undeserved kindness. And we've all experienced that as well. Even later, as we get closer to the actual institution of the priesthood, we see Aaron, Moses' brother, who becomes really the father of the priesthood. He himself is cursed for rebelling against Moses and for leading the people of Israel to worship a golden calf. And yet this is the one who becomes the leader of the priests in Israel. So this is another picture of God's grace, that God, despite the poor beginnings and at times faithless acts, that God redeems people beyond what they deserve. I also say there's a hint somewhat in the actions of Levi at what the role of the future the priests will be. The priests are there to keep and guard and preserve the holiness of God. It's interesting that the thing that Jacob resents Levi for is the murderous episode at Shechem, where Simeon and Levi go and they kill a whole city of men. And that is a grotesque war crime, essentially. It's murderous wrath. It's not good. But it's interesting when Jacob rebukes them for this. Simeon and Levi say, was our sister to be called a prostitute by the people in the land? They're concerned for the reputation of their name and their sister's name among the people. And so they see a need to go and avenge the immorality that had been enacted against her. And while that is a sinful manifestation, an overzealous anger that is unjustly meted out against people who are not all guilty in killing the whole city of Shechem, there is in it a hint of what the future role of the Levites will be, which is a zealous protection of the name of God and the willingness even to go and eliminate and destroy those who would profane God's name. And so even in Levi's checkered and immoral past, there's a hint of what God's grace is going to do in redeeming this tribe for his great purposes.
What is the significance of the phrase that Judah's hand will be on the neck of your enemies?
It's an interesting phrase that I think has an echo to it of the phrase that we've heard earlier in the book of Genesis, the promise that was spoken over the woman and the serpent in Genesis 3:15, that there will be constant enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and that the serpent would bite at the heel of the seed of the woman, but the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. I think that there's some echo there of this idea of head of the serpent crushed by the heel, and then hand on the neck of enemies. There's some similar language there. But then later in Psalm 18, verse 40, David says, "You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me I destroyed." But there our Bibles are doing a little bit of translation work or adjustment there to what the actual Hebrew says. The actual Hebrew of Psalm 18:40 says, "You gave me my enemies' necks." Not they turned their backs. That's, again, a softening or a transliterating of the phrase. The literal is, "You gave me my enemies' necks," which just seems odd to us, which is why the translators have tried to give us what maybe a more English understanding of that phraseology might mean, to a more fluid translation. But I think the more wooden translation or the more literal translation is better there, because I think David is intentionally seeing himself as a member of the tribe of Judah, as Judah's heir. He's claiming that promise that God gave to Judah's tribe through the mouth of Jacob, that to you I'm going to give your hand on the neck of your enemies. And David is saying, I'm the king that's coming from Judah. You've given me my enemies next. In the same way that later the greater son of David, who will therefore be the greater son of Judah, Jesus Christ, he's going to be the strong man. He's going to come in, or he's going to be the mighty champion who's going to come in and take over the house of the strong man, the devil, and will eventually put his heel on the head of the serpent.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.